All right. So we're going to talk about the War of 1812 today for a couple of reasons. One is this war is oftentimes nicknamed the Second American War for Independence. Part of the reason for that, as we're going to see today, is as a new nation, we don't get too much respect after the American Revolution. Um, to kind of quote South Park, respect my authority. Nobody really pays attention to us or really kind of respects us when we try to kind of put our foot down or assert, that we should be respected as a nation. And that's going to get us into the War of 1812 because, as we're going to see today, both Great Britain and France really don't deal with us as equal partners during this time, and we get caught in the middle of a war between those two nations. So the other reason I want to talk about the War of 1812, because obviously with us meeting online, right, we only have one meeting a week versus the normal like 2 or 3 that you would for a face-to-face class. That means I have to strategically pick what we cover out of the material for any given week. And one of the reasons I picked the War of 1812 was because this year, as of recording 2021, was the first time the U.S. Capitol building had been under attack since the War of 1812. So that was the other thing for me, was that it felt very timely as I was finishing my syllabus. The Capitol was under attack. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, the last time that DC faced a direct attack by a hostile force. And towards the end of today, we're also going to set up some of the major players for the subsequent weeks in class. For example, we're going to talk about a couple of young senators that are new to the national scene during the War of 1812, but are going to be hugely influential in the lead up to the American Civil War. All right. Okay, so to understand what I said about the lack of respect for the United States as a new nation after we won our war for independence from Great Britain, we need to talk about what's going on between Britain and France. So just to give you sort of a very quick Cliff's Notes version, because I also teach world history and we get into this in much more detail, Great Britain and France really historically have not gotten along. My husband likes to joke that this is a 1,000-year-old grudge because a group of Normans, a ethnicity in France, invaded England in 1066. And since then, the relationship between England and France has been rocky. They've been to war a bunch of times. So in the early 1800s, Great Britain and France are at war again. Okay, starting in 1803, the war is back on between the two, and it drags on. And remember, this is also the time period where France is undergoing some changes, as your textbook talked about, right? The French Revolution, which is much longer and messier than the American Revolution, is still going on off and on at this time. So Great Britain and France are still fighting with each other. Now, we are neutral. Okay, the United States is like, we don't want any bit of this. We have no desire to get involved in foreign wars. But we get dragged in anyways, because by 1806, Great Britain and France tried to blockade each other. Anybody know what is a blockade? Any ideas what it sound like?
They were blocking the people from coming in, I guess, or
Right, some kind of block or barriers. Tori also mentioned in the chat, right? So the idea is you're preventing not just people, but also product from coming in, right? So basically it's a trade barrier. So you're trying to prevent your enemy from doing trade, okay, from getting outside assistance. Normally, again, in war, neutral nations can still trade. So the United States is still trading with Great Britain and France. But once they declare that blockade of each other, they started seizing any ships that tried to come in through that blockade. So that means American ships, right, that are trying to trade because we're neutral, are getting seized by the British and the French navies. On top of that, the British in particular engage in a practice known as impressment. Now, usually we hear the word impress and we think, like you're showing off, right? Trying to make a good impression on, that somewhat special. But in this case, impressment means forcing people into service. So what the British are doing is when they're seizing American ships, they're actually also seizing American sailors on those ships and forcing them into service in the British Navy. Okay, that's what impressment means. The idea that we're forcing these American sailors who are, again, they're not part of the US Navy, they're just, sailors on trading ships. They're forcing them into service in the British Navy. In 1 year alone, between 1806 and 1807, 6,000 Americans were impressed into service in the British Navy. Okay? And lest you think the British are just snatching ships that get close to England, in the most notorious case, the British seized the ship Chesapeake off the coast of Maryland. So they're not just attacking American ships that get close to France in that potential blockade, they're going after American ships everywhere in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Okay? So this is a problem. We don't want to get dragged into war. We don't want our American citizens to be forced into British naval service against their will. So Thomas Jefferson, who's president at the time that this is going on, says, look, we need to de-escalate. We need to get out of this situation. So he urges Congress to pass the Embargo Act in 1807. The Embargo Act was designed to prevent trade. So an embargo means a hold on trade, to prevent trade with the French and the British. But the way they do this is they say no American ship can leave port. So basically all trade, all seagoing trade from the United States is halted. Because Jefferson's logic is, if you don't leave to go out to sea, you can't be caught and impressed. What downside might that have?
It affects their trade with other countries. So the things that they aren't particularly making at the time, they can't receive from other countries, or
Right.
or export if they're doing any kind of business elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly, Tori. So yeah, it's affecting American business. They can't import goods, they can't export products. So what traditionally happens when Americans are faced with a law they don't like?
They rebel.
Yes. So in this case, they just gave a giant middle finger to Congress and smuggling starts. So people start sneaking out of port in violation of this act. Because they're like, damn you, it's hurting my business. I'm going to trade anyways. I'm just going to sneak out. The US Navy is then used to try to crack down on smuggling, and Americans just freak out. They're like, this reminds us of the intolerable acts during the American Revolution when the port of Boston was closed, right? And the Embargo Act sees 80% drop in American exports. That's a huge impact to the American economy, particularly port cities like Boston or New York or Charleston are the most heavily affected by this. So this is not very popular. In 1809, to try to fix the Embargo Act, Congress passes the Non-Intercourse Act. Now, I do have to say something here. We today use intercourse as shorthand for sex, right? Sexual intercourse. They're not banning sex with this act. Intercourse, if you look at it in the dictionary, just means exchange. Okay, so today we kind of use it more to be like a sexual exchange, but it just meant any exchange during this time period. So Non-Intercourse Act was meant to still limit trade, right? We're not going to, conduct an exchange of goods and services with the French or the British, but we're not going to have our ports sealed off anymore anyways. Okay, so they remove this closure of American ports, but they say that you still cannot trade with Great Britain and France. Okay, we're still not trading with them because they're not playing nicely with us and respecting our sovereignty, okay, our power as a nation, but we're no longer going to completely shut down our foreign trade. So Jefferson, the Non-Intercourse Act is one of the last things he signs before he leaves office in early 1809. And his successor is James Madison. Okay, you might remember James Madison from our class last week. Remember, he was the one who took all those notes about the Constitutional Convention that were later published after his death, and that's how we know kind of the background of what was happening there. So in addition to being a very thorough note taker, James Madison is our 4th president of the United States. Madison's time in office is really dominated by foreign affairs. He inherits this problem from Jefferson of Great Britain and France trying to drag the United States into a war. He believes, though, however, that war is dangerous to a republic. For him, the question became, how can you be a representational form of government with certain guaranteed liberties, including things like freedom of speech, the press, and assembly, at a time of war, right? Also, war is expensive, which means raising taxes. You also need to raise an army. So he said, you know, war is really dangerous. Not only is there going to be this temptation to crack down on civil liberties in the name of helping to fight the war, but we're also going to get into debt, and that's going to lead to problems. I mean, remember, debt was indirectly what led to the American Revolution, right? Debt from the 7 Years' War. And that's also going to have a ripple effect in France as well. That's going to lead to their revolution, is debt from the 7 Years' War and helping the Americans in the war for independence. Okay. So Madison really, 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 really wants to avoid the United States getting dragged into war. Now, Madison, in his reluctance to go to war, is faced with a group of relatively young congressmen who really do want to go to war. Okay. One of the things that Madison does in 1810 is he encourages Congress to pass Macon's Bill No. 2, which was an attempt to try to use the carrot approach, an incentive to get the British and the French to stop raiding American shipping. So basically, he said, we will trade with you only if you stop attacking us. And then the extra bonus was, whoever stops attacking us first will trade exclusively with you and will continue to not trade with the other person, okay, the other nation. So he's trying to kind of incentivize not attacking American shipping. So the French stop attacking American shipping because they want to trade with us and they want to continue to deny the British, and the British still attack. So Madison then has to reimpose the embargo on the British as of 1812, because the problem of impressment, of forcing American citizens into service in the British Navy, is continuing during this time. Now, in Congress, the reaction to the continued attacks by the British and the impressment of American citizens into the British Navy roused up a young contingent of congressmen who really felt that we should go to war to defend our honor as a nation. This group gets the nickname the War Hawks because they are in favor of declaring war with Great Britain over this. Most of these guys are young. They're mostly from Western states, and at this time, Western would be like Kentucky. And they argue that Britain will never respect us as a nation unless we stand up to them. So the two most notable members of the War Hawks are Henry Clay of Kentucky on the left, And actually, no, on the right, I forgot the pictures got flipped here. And John C. Calhoun of South Carolina on the left here. Now, look at their life dates. So Clay is born in 1777. John C. Calhoun is born in 1782. What's kind of notable about that? Are you there? What's happening around the time that they're born? They're born either during or right after the American Revolution. So in other words, like most of the people who've been dominating American politics up until this point, including Madison as the president, they were the generation that served in the American Revolution, whether in government or in military. But now these guys are young enough that they don't remember the American Revolution. Now look at their death dates, 1852 and 1850. So they're born after the revolution and then they die before what happens? Hint, it's another major war. The American Civil War, right, which starts in 1861. So these guys are going to be really influential in this transition period between the Revolution and the generation that served and fought in the Revolution and the American Civil War. This will not be the last time that we talk about Calhoun or Clay. Okay, so consider this your introduction to them. They're going to be hugely influential for the next several chapters of your book. All right, not only did Calhoun and Clay and others of these young war hawks want to defend our national honor, they also felt that going to war would be a great way to add more territory. Particularly, they're eyeballing Florida, which is currently at that time owned by, I don't know, Florida goes back and forth. I can't remember at this point whether it's the British or the Spanish who own it at this point in time. And then Canada, which is a British territory. It must be the British if they're looking at Florida at this time. Yeah, Florida goes back and forth, back and forth. So does Louisiana. So it gets a little confusing. All right. So they say, you know, war could be great. We can defend our national honor. Maybe we can add some more territory out of it. But there's also other things going on at home that Madison is more worried about, particularly Native Americans. So while Thomas Jefferson was president, we doubled our national territory with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, adding all of this territory in the Mississippi River Valley that had previously been owned by France. However, this sets us up for direct conflict with Native Americans. The question becomes, what's going to happen to Native Americans living in that territory? Jefferson felt that Native Americans could not live peacefully side by side with white Americans. And so Jefferson is going to be one of the early proponents of this idea of removal, to remove Native Americans and shift them to territory west of the Mississippi River. Okay. This is made more feasible by adding the Louisiana Territory. Jefferson encourages people to buy up Native American land in the East to try to kind of force Native Americans into debt so they would be more likely to leave and go west. And this kind of spotlights the difficulty that Native Americans faced in the new United States. George Washington, during his time in office, had tried to encourage Native Americans to assimilate, so to blend in to white culture by giving up claims to tribal land, settling down and becoming small-scale farmers, adopting more sort of white culture, including dressing the way that white Americans did, speaking English, maybe owning a couple of slaves. That's pretty popular in the South, especially among the Cherokee. And this leads to a bit of a crisis in Native American communities. How do we deal with this pressure on us to give up our Native traditions and way of life? And how do we deal with this attempt to push Native Americans out of their traditional homelands to the farther west? On the one hand, there are some proponents of why don't we just assimilate? This is especially more prominent in groups like the Cherokee and the Creek, where they're in the Southeast, where there have been a lot of intermixing between these groups and white settlers. So this population was very mixed, was more sort of already adjusted to white culture. But there were a lot of Native Americans who wanted to reject this idea of assimilation, reject being pushed off of their native land. And this second group is going to try to bring back a more sort of pure way of life that they had lived before. And in particular, a really important person in this idea is revisiting Neolin. So you read about Neolin during the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's Rebellion. He was a prophet from the Delaware tribe who had said that the way for Native Americans to thrive is to reject this European and American culture and embrace Native ways of life. But at the same time, he also, for the first time, advocated that Native Americans identify with each other, not by individual tribes, but join together and oppose white people. So Neolin's ideas from a couple decades earlier are revisited by a pair of Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. So Tenskwatawa of the two brothers is the prophet. He revisits the ideas of Neolin. He preaches that all white people are evil and that Native Americans should completely reject anything having to do with white people, including non-native goods like guns or alcohol. And he said the only way for Native Americans to thrive was to live completely separate from white Americans. So Tenskwatawa is the prophet. He's the ideas man. Tecumseh, his brother, is the guy that kind of is a man of action. He's a military leader. He travels throughout the Mississippi River Valley, trying to build alliances across different tribes, saying, look, we either work together or we're defeated by these guys. And the center of this movement of Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh is at Prophetstown, which was a site on the Wabash River in Indiana. Now, how do you think white Americans responded to this message of all white people being evil and Native Americans needing to sort of defend themselves and remove themselves? Not well. Yes, white people do not like generally to be criticized or called evil. This was an alarming for the American government, right? That they saw this as an attack on them and that these guys are hostile. So the American military sent in troops to fight Tecumseh at Prophetstown under the leadership of William Henry Harrison, who will later be elected as president and has the distinction of being our shortest serving president. He only lived a month. He fights them at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is where William Henry Harrison will get his nickname of Old Tippecanoe following this. So they managed to destroy Prophetstown, but they don't defeat Tecumseh or Tenskwatawa. They live to fight another day. So that's more what Madison is focused on, is problems at home. However, the British decide, because remember, the British are still present in Canada, they still have possession of Canada. The British decide that they're going to support Tecumseh. And that raises alarm bells for Madison, because not only are the British attacking American shipping in the Atlantic and forcing American citizens into naval service in the British Navy, but now the British are messing with Native Americans in the West. That's our home turf. So the United States will declare war in 1812 against the British. Okay, that was the final straw, was getting involved in what we saw as our own sort of internal affairs. It's important to note that this was not a popular decision. The slimmest margin ever in American history to declare a war. The South and the West voted almost universally in favor. The North is the region that doesn't really want to get involved in this. This is our first declared war in US history. And kind of like the American Revolution, things don't look super great for us right now at the start of the war. For one thing, the fact that we were almost evenly split on whether we should go to war with Great Britain means it's going to be very difficult to fight a war because there are a lot of people who don't think we should be in the war. We don't have a large standing army or navy, and the British have the best army and navy in the world at that point. And then the Bank of the United States, which you read about as being Alexander Hamilton's brainchild, was no longer in existence at this point in time. So we didn't have like a national sort of money management system or fundraising system set up. Instead, we have to turn to northern businesses and investors, and actually the United States government goes bankrupt during this time. All right. So it's not looking great for us. We're not the most well organized. We're not the most prepared. We're not all on the same page as to whether war is necessary. However, remember, Great Britain is still fighting France, so they're distracted for the first part of the war. We do attempt to invade Canada during this time. The Canadians beat us back. There have been a lot of Americans who felt that like Canada was an eventual place of expansion for us. The Canadians very politely said, no, thank you, please get off our lawn. We do have some early wins, especially fighting in the Navy and the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes region. And the most famous moment of the War of 1812 happens in Baltimore when Fort McHenry withstands a barrage by the British Navy. This is famous because a young poet named Francis Scott Key witnessed the attack on Fort McHenry and wrote a poem about it that you will know very well. Anybody know what this poem was called? It's no longer a poem, it's now a song. It was set to music. I guarantee you, you know it by heart. Whether you can sing it, I don't know.
The Star Spangled Banner. The Star Spangled
Yes. Good job, Tori. The Star Spangled Banner. Okay. It will not become our national anthem until the 1930s. Initially, part of the reason, by the way, that it's so hard to sing that song is the music predates the poem. Basically, someone thought the poem might work really well with an existing song that was popularly sung by drunk people in bars. So our national anthem, the music for it, comes from an old drinking song. Okay. So if you think about it that way, if people are supposed to be drunk while singing it, it makes a little bit more sense. All right, so the withstanding of Fort McHenry obviously has given us this lasting legacy of our national anthem. However, after the British successfully defeat Napoleon Bonaparte of France in Europe, now they can pay all of their attention to us in fighting this war against us. So the war takes a turn for the worse in 1814, when the British successfully established a blockade of the United States and then invade Washington, D.C. They attack the Capitol building. They burn the White House to the ground. James Madison's wife, Dolly Madison, in her very quick thinking, saved a number of really important documents and artifacts from the American Revolution from being burned to a crisp by evacuating them with her, including a life-size portrait of George Washington, some copies of things like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. So we credit her a lot with having the kind of quick thinking to be able to save a lot of our sort of early resources. So she was also, by the way, a fantastic hostess. Apparently, she gets, generally when you see, like, it's less common to see rankings of first ladies than presidents, but Dolly Madison is usually pretty high up there. So our capital was attacked and occupied by a foreign nation. The only time so far it has happened, and as I mentioned, the January 6th attack on the Capitol was only the second time that the Capitol has ever been under siege in American history, with the first time being in 1814. Things are going a little bit better in the West. William Henry Harrison has his rematch with Tecumseh and manages to actually defeat and kill Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames, which, despite its name, is not in England, but rather in Michigan, in 1813. A young Tennessean by the name of Andrew Jackson, who, again, we'll talk all about next week, because I believe that's our topic for next week on the schedule, is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is fighting in the Southeast, so places like today, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and fighting alongside American allied Cherokee and Creek Native Americans against a band of Creeks called the Red Sticks, who were allied with the British. So, bless you. Sorry, my husband is a very loud sneezer. So Jackson and his Native American forces successfully defeat the Red Stick Band of Creek at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama in 1814. By the way, if you have ever watched the Disney film version from the 1950s of Davy Crockett, it depicts this. Davy Crockett is one of the volunteers that serves under Jackson. So the first part of the Davy Crockett Disney film is depicting this campaign against the Red Stick Creek. So Jackson, after defeating the Red Stick Creek, negotiates a peace treaty that requires Native Americans in this region, not only the ones who fought against Americans, but also his allies, to cough up 23 million acres of their land to the U.S. government. Okay, 23 million acres. Again, not just of the people he defeated, but the people who helped him. There's a reason that people don't remember Jackson very fondly, because of how he dealt with Native Americans, both during this time and also later when he's president of the United States, which, again, I believe that's our topic for next week, is talking about Andrew Jackson as president. All right. How does the war end then? If it started well and then it's going very badly for us, at least, with our capital being occupied and burned. While the Americans are fighting the British in Canada at sea, again in the DC area, and fighting British and Indian forces in the interior, they start to make some progress towards the end of 1814. The most famous battle, other than the torching of DC, of the War of 1812 is actually Andrew Jackson's led Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. So Jackson had, after defeating the Red Stick Creek Band, had moved west into Louisiana and the area around New Orleans, and worked together with a contingent of free African Americans to repel an attempted British invasion of the city of New Orleans. Now, contrary to his treatment of his Native American allies, Jackson actually called these free African American Sons of Freedom and promised them the same benefits of service as the white troops, i.e. land and pay. What is interesting about this date of the Battle of New Orleans, 1815, compared to the peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent below that, which is 1814?
The battle is after the treaty was placed, I guess.
Yes. Technically, the war is already over. before the Battle of New Orleans. So why are they fighting after the peace treaty has already been signed? Any ideas?
I think it, as far as what I was reading, it was on a ship and it didn't make it in time.
Yep. Communication problems, right. Remember, it takes a lot longer to send messages during this time period because we don't have telephones or the internet or anything else, right? We don't have the telegram yet or the telegraph yet. That is still a couple decades away. So yes, slow communication, which is why the Battle of New Orleans happened. Okay. So the Treaty of Ghent, which is signed in, I think, December of 1814, if I remember correctly, really reflects how exhausted both the Americans and the British were of fighting. Remember, the Americans didn't have much of an appetite for the war in the first place. The British had spent well over a decade at this point fighting the French. Nobody really wants to fight anymore. So because of that, the treaty doesn't do very much. Nobody gets any territory. There's not even an attempt by the Americans to get an apology for impressment. That's not even in there. You would think that would be the one thing in there, right? Instead, the only thing it does is the British acknowledge our sovereignty or our authority as a nation. That's it. So as far as peace treaties go, it's not very distinguished, but it at least does the job. So this is part of the reason why some historians nickname it the Second American War for Independence, because finally the British seem to be taking us seriously as a nation. Obviously, you know, we could have maybe gotten a better deal out of the peace treaty, but if nothing else, our main concern going into the war, right, that the British were messing with us in a way that didn't respect us as a nation, that is addressed. Now, the aftermath of the war. There are a couple of takeaways that we can get from the War of 1812. One is Madison's concerns about the impact of war on the health of a Republican, small r, form of government. His concerns appeared to be overblown. Despite the fact that our government went bankrupt fighting the war, we survived relatively unscathed. We didn't suspend elections or the court system, even when DC was under attack. We didn't suspend anybody's civil liberties. So on that note, good. The war also showed the ability of Americans to give up civilian life and become soldiers to defend the nation as necessary. And that they did well in the face of much more professionalized armies and navies during the war. So this idea in the United States that we have of the citizen soldier, right, that Americans are ready to take up arms to defend our homeland if they're needed, this is where this starts to become more solidified, right? Obviously, we had cases of that with the militia and the Minutemen, right, in the American Revolution, but now this kind of continues. And so the other fear that Madison had was that going to war would mean that the temptation after the war would be to keep larger armies. That doesn't come true. Okay, so we still have a professional army, but it shrinks down when we're not at war. Okay, so Madison's fear that we were going to have this larger professionalized army and that would be a threat to peace doesn't pan out. Now, is Madison right to be concerned about civil liberties and war in the long term? Yes. Yeah. We're going to talk about some civil liberties violation during the American Civil War. And then when we get to History 1302, we're going to talk about like World War I, which was disastrous for civil liberties. I actually get to talk about that in my 1302 class today at 11. And also things like 9/11 and the Patriot Act in more recent American history. So Madison's concerns are founded, just not immediately borne out during the War of 1812. The other thing that happens as a result of the War of 1812 is we gain more solid control of territory east of the Mississippi River, because what is today Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, these were territories that, even though we owned them on paper, they were more heavily controlled by Native American tribes, and that had prevented white settlers from going into this region before the War of 1812. But now with that concession of 23 million acres of land that Jackson got from Native American groups during the war, this is where we start to see the land become more available to white settlers who start pouring into places not only in the South, like Alabama and Mississippi, but also even in the old Northwest, like Indiana and Michigan. Because remember, those were the places of the strongholds of the Shawnee, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. So with Native Americans being weakened, this allows for white settlers to start moving into these territories much more easily than they had before. Kind of the last takeaway from the War of 1812 is this is where our dreams of adding Canada to the United States go to die. Prior to this, the United States had really, thought that Canada, being a sister colony, right, of the British at the time of the American Revolution, might eventually come over to our side. However, this war really illustrates the difference between Canadians and Americans, and also starts to create some of the stereotypes we have about Canadians and Americans today. So, for example, if you think of somebody who's Canadian today, what's kind of the stereotypical description of someone who's Canadian? Anybody want to take a stab at it? You think Canadian, like, what do you think? Besides cold. It's cold up there.
I just think of their accent.
The accent?
Yeah, that's
right?
what I was gonna say. Their big accent. You
Eh?
can't hide it.
Yeah, it's very like I mean, if you go to some of the northern states like Michigan or Dakota, they're closer in accent to Canadians than those of us down here. But yeah, Canadians have that distinctive accent. Okay. What do Canadians like to do? What's our stereotypical like version of what a Canadian is like besides the accent? Anybody know? I'm probably more aware of it because I come from a long line of Michiganders. There's this notion they like to play hockey, right? They like their beer. Yep, hockey, as Nicole said in the chat, hockey, lots of love for hockey. Beer, that they're overly polite. In fact, some of my Canadian friends love to share a meme that says that Canadians are so polite because all of their aggression is channeled into Canadian geese, which are very nasty creatures, by the way. You don't mess with Canadian geese. One of my dogs learned that the hard way when we lived in North Carolina. That's right, Joy. You know not to mess with Canadian geese anymore, don't you? She had it with on.
Where did you live in North Carolina? I'm just curious.
I used to live in Durham.
Me too. That's where I'm from.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, my husband went to UNC Chapel Hill.
Oh, cool. Well, I'm a Duke fan, so it's okay.
I won't tell him that. I'm neutral. I did not go to UNC or Duke. So.
Well, that's where I was born and raised, so I was just curious. That's fun.
Yep. But yeah, Joy learned her lesson. She's also from Durham, not to mess with geese, Canadian geese. So we got that stereotype of Canadians as polite, as kind of a little bit more European culture than we are. Like even today, for example, think about it. They have socialized medicine there, right? They have a national system of healthcare, which is much more close to Europe than our model. And then Canadian stereotypes of us also start to form during this period. Anybody know, how are Americans seen abroad? Anybody have any idea how the rest of the world sees us?
Hopefully well.
I'm going to break it to
maybe that
you.
we're behind.
Yes, they see us as backward, kind of like they kind of think all Americans are crazy rednecks. When I traveled abroad, I've been abroad a couple of times. there was always a lot of, oh, you're American. Where are you from? Texas. Oh. You know.
That the overseas where like my husband goes and stuff, they think that we're all cowboys.
Mhm.
And they also think that when we take our like our Oakleys off, that some of them think we have lasers in our eyes and stuff. Like from the ones that he's like from being like in the linguist with the linguist, they'll tell them that they think we can't take our sunglasses off. So
We're kind of like the mutant Cyclops, right, in the X-Men.
right. So it's kind of interesting how they perceive us. They all think we're cowboys with laser eyes.
Yeah. So basically, Americans are seen as like less sophisticated, more rough and tumble, more comfortable with violence. We're kind of like that again, that like crazy family member, right? That you kind of want to give a wide berth at family gatherings. So like the stereotypes of like Canadians is super polite, more European, and Americans is a little bit more sort of rough and tumble, maybe violent. Like Canadians have guns, but they don't get American gun culture. They're like, we don't understand your obsession with your Second Amendment. So this is where some of our relationship with Canada starts to become born, is during this time period. So at this point in time, it becomes very clear we're never really going to add Canada. They have at this point become different from us culturally, even though we both started out as British colonies. So yeah, this ends our dream of adding Canada. But Florida, as we mentioned earlier in the talk today, is still in play. And in fact, we will add Florida by diplomatic treaty a couple years after this. Does anybody have any questions about the War of 1812? You now know some trivia. If somebody asks you when was the War of 1812 fought, it's not just 1812, right? 1812 to 1814. So the next time you appear on Jeopardy. All right, no questions? All right, I will stop the recording. Let's see. Okay. All right. By the way,